Here we're looking at section 3.4, and we're going to be starting to multiply and divide these integers. Now remember, when we've been talking about integers, we're dealing with positives and negative numbers. Okay, so right here are your learning targets. So make sure that you note these down, right? So by the end of this section, when we walk through this, you're going to be able to multiply and divide them. But then you're also going to be able to simplify expressions. That's a very important thing that we do. And then evaluate. Remember, when we evaluate, we are plugging something in. So then we're also going to be translating some word phrases to algebraic expressions. So let's start by multiplying these integers. Okay, so multiplication, really remember, is repeated addition over and over and over again. So for example, if I'm multiplying 5 times 3, that means I've got 5 plus 5 plus 5, that 3 times. So I would have 15 positive values. Well, now I'm going to add that negative in there. So if I have a negative 5, that means I'm adding negative 5 3 different times. So I've got negative 5 plus negative 5 plus negative 5, which gives me a negative 15. So you'll see that if I have a negative value that I'm multiplying times a positive, I'm going to end up with a negative. So this also means I'm going to be, if I have that negative as my 3, it means I'm subtracting 5 3 different times. So that is really going to give us the same result. Okay, and you can just see those pictures here if those help you. Okay. So here's kind of our big, huge thing that you need to have in your notes, okay? So multiplication of signed numbers. So if I have the same signs, either 2 positives or 2 negatives, my result is going to be positive, okay? It doesn't matter if I've got negatives or positives. If they have different signs and I'm multiplying, my result is going to be negative. It doesn't matter if it's the first one that's positive or the second one that's positive. As long as the signs are different, I'm going to have a negative result. So here, the first thing I would ask myself, right, is on this part A, let's do part A together. I've got negative 9 times 3. Well, first I see that one of them is negative and the other one is positive, so I know I will have a negative answer. Then I know that 9 times 3 is 27. So let's look at this part D right here. Okay, so D, I have 7 times 6, so I know that they're both positive, so they're the same thing. So my result is going to be positive, and then I can just multiply 7 times 6, which gives me 42. So that's all we need to really do is when multiplying. Okay, so now here are a few that I want you to try. So look right here at this, try it. This is going to be your big question here that you need to answer. So what you need to tell me out of these 4 is which one or ones will give us a negative answer. So now when we're also going to be dealing with the number 1, right? And sometimes we like with the 1 because it doesn't really change anything. So when I multiply anything by 1, I get the same thing that I started with. So now what happens if I have that negative 1? Well, same idea. So I have a negative 1 times a positive 4. Well, I see that they have different signs, so my answer is going to be a negative. Well, here I have a negative 1 times a negative 3. Oh, they have the same sign. It doesn't matter that it's negative, it's the same. So I'm going to have a positive. This negative 1 that we're multiplying by really just means the opposite. We're finding the opposite. Okay, so if I have a positive, it will become negative, and if I have a negative, it will become positive. Okay, so here's also something that needs to go in your notes. Okay, so multiplying a number by negative 1 gives its opposite. Then give yourself an example of, oh, if I take a positive value and I multiply it times a negative 1, it gives me a negative. So now let's try this, right? So I see I started with a positive times a negative, so my signs here are different, so I know I will have a negative, and 1 times 7 is 7. So here, a negative times a negative, the signs are the same, so I will end up with a positive value, and 11 times 1 is 11. So really I can do the same thing, it's just dealing with a 1 instead of other multiplications. Okay, so that's it for multiplying. So now we know we've met that first learning target. So now let's look at division. Division is really just the opposite of multiplication. So I know that it's going to be very similar to what we just did. Okay, so if we look at these examples right here, I know 5 times 3 is 15. That also tells me that I can divide 15 by 3 to get 5. Well, that's true also if I have positives and negatives. I know from above that a negative 5 times 3 gives me that negative 15. So I also know that negative 15 divided by that positive 3 would give me a negative 5. So again, I can follow here. And this also needs to go in your notes. You'll start seeing that a lot of these gray boxes are the big things that we have to keep remembering. So if I have the same signs, I'm going to end up with a positive quotient. Right? And quotient just means I'm dividing. So if the signs are the same, either positive or negative, I end up with a positive result. If the signs are different, if one of them is positive and one of them is negative, it doesn't matter the order, I will end up with a negative quotient once I divide. Okay, so let's try this first example. So I have a negative 27 divided by 3. Well, first I see that I have a negative and a positive, so I know that my answer will be negative. And I know that 27 divided by 3 is 9. So looking at example B, I see I have a negative and a negative. Well, since both of them are the same, I know it's going to be a positive answer, and I know that 100 divided by 4 is 25. So now let's just see a couple. If you want some more examples, I have them. Okay. So just like we talked above, when I multiply by a -1, it changes the sign. Same thing when I divide a number by -1. I still get that opposite value. So again, here I have a positive and a negative, so my answer would be a negative, and 16 divided by 1 is 16. So really just that negative just changes the sign when I multiply or divide by 1. Great, so that was the second learning target, dividing by those negatives. So now we're going to be simplifying. When we simplify, we always want to follow the order of operations. And for many of us, it's easier to remember. We either know PEMDAS or we know it as like a cake and a tower. Because the easiest thing to do in math is to add and subtract. And then if I do that over and over and over again, I multiply or divide. And then if I do that over and over again, that's where we get our exponents. And these parentheses up at the very top tell us do something out of order. Okay, so we're going to follow our order of operations, okay, when we do these. And we always go from left to right, just as you read. So here I see, oh, I'm multiplying, and I know that I'm multiplying these two, even though there's no sign in between. When they're right next to each other, that just means multiply. So 7 times a -2, it's a positive times a negative, so the signs are different, so it's going to be negative 14. Then this plus sign just comes down. Then I see I'm multiplying again, because again, nothing's in between them. Again, I see I have a positive and a negative, which would give me a negative. 4 times 7 is 28, minus 6. Well, now that I've done all of the multiplication, I don't see any division, so now I can go ahead and simplify. So I have negative 14 plus a negative 28 minus 6, which you will see will give us a negative 48. Okay, so we just follow our order of operations when we do this, when we multiply and divide as well. Okay, so again, we're dealing with some exponents, right? And remember that an exponent just tells us how many times we multiply it together. So here you'll notice on this example, and this is really important, that there are parentheses around this first one, and there are not parentheses around this second one. That's really important to notice. So here I see I have a -2 times a -2 times a -2 times a -2. Well, these two negatives, if I multiply these first, will give me a positive 4 because the signs are the same. Then if I can multiply continuing on from left to right, I see I have 4 times a -2, so a positive times a negative gives me a negative. Then I see I have a negative times a negative, which gives me positive. Okay, so that's our first example. Now for this second part where there's not parentheses, I'm not told to put this negative in with that exponent. So here I have 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, and then a negative out front. So that answer will give me a negative 16. And those are very different things. So when you are dealing with exponents and evaluating things, make sure you're very careful with your parentheses. Okay, so here's another thing we need to simplify. Let's talk about this one. So first we always do the things in the parentheses first. So I want to subtract the parentheses first. So I would have 12, which stays there, minus 3, and then I deal with the inside of the parentheses and multiply that. Well, so now I see I am going to be multiplying, and a negative times a negative would end up giving me a positive, right? So that's how I end up with 21. So here's a couple that you can try as well to see how you're doing on this multiplying. So now there's some more examples of just simplifying. We're going to kind of move on. So now we're going to be evaluating, right? And that is that other learning target that we're dealing with. When we're evaluating, we plug in. That means take whatever you have and plug it in. And here it's really important to use your parentheses. So evaluate this expression, and I know it's an expression because I don't have an equal sign, when x equals 4. So that just tells me anywhere there was an x, plug in a negative 4. And you want to make sure and use your parentheses. So I have 2 times that negative 4 squared minus 3 times negative 4 plus 8. That's exactly what we got here. And see how they used parentheses as well? That's very important, as we saw above. So now I'm going to simplify my exponents first. So I know a negative 4 times a negative 4 gives me a positive 16. Then I go ahead and I multiply the things that I have. So I've got 32 times 16 is 32. 3 times a negative 4 is negative 12. And I leave all of my other signs alone. So then I can just subtract. And since I'm subtracting the opposite, it turns into adding. And I come up with my final answer. So we always make sure, big important thing here is make sure that you are using your parentheses when you are evaluating. Oh, so now we're going to be working on that final learning target, is translating word phrases to algebraic expressions. So here, I always start, but I'm given words, and I have to turn it into algebra. So the first thing we always have to figure out is what words am I being asked to do? So translate an algebraic expression to simplify if possible. The product of negative 2 and 14. Well, first we have to think, okay, what does product tell me to do? Product tells me to multiply. So I know I'm multiplying these two values, and then I can go ahead and simplify. And I see that one is negative and one is positive, so I will end up with a negative result. So here's one that I want you to try. Go ahead and try this one and see what you can come up with. So the other big word that we need to be careful of for this section, right, is quotient. If I know that product tells me to multiply, then I know that quotient is going to tell me to divide. So we always start with our words of like, what am I supposed to do? And then figure out where your values go from there. Okay. So that's it. Let's just double check our learning targets way back at the beginning. Okay. So we were supposed to multiply integers. We looked at that and the difference of the signs. We also did division. So simplifying expressions with integers, we did that as well when we looked at our order of operations and how that works. Evaluating, just plugging in, big thing here, remember, use parentheses. That's the important part, because you will use those often or you will not get the right answer. Then we translated word phrases to algebraic expressions, and then we simplified them. So now we have gone through all of our learning targets for 3.4.